Well, hello, everyone. This is the first installment in what I'm calling the COVID-19 language tidbits. So I was thinking last night about sort of the language that we use to describe or have been using to describe this virus, this pandemic. And it occurred to me that there are some sort of interesting linguistic components to the discourse that we've been using. So I wanted to talk about two of those things today, and hopefully if other things occur to me, I'll post them as well. We have a very special guest for this presentation. So I'd like to introduce you to my wife, Rachel. Say hello.
Hello.
This is Rachel. She works at Winthrop as well, so we are spending a lot of time at home together right now. So you should definitely keep her in your thoughts. I'm difficult to live with in general, but 24 hours a day, I'm sure it's practically intolerable. Anyway, so I wanted to sort of talk very briefly about two different words. Well, you tell me, Rachel, what sorts of words, what sorts of language have we been using to talk about the coronavirus? And while you're doing this, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen.
Quarantine?
Ah, yes, quarantine. It's almost like we planned this. Yeah, quarantine, absolutely. So quarantine is a really interesting word. Do you happen to know the origin of the word quarantine?
Something Italian.
Yes, it is absolutely something Italian. So if you've studied any Spanish, you probably know that the word quarantine, or the sort of the beginning, the qua, reminds you of something in Spanish. So what do you all think? What does it remind you of? Is there any other words in Spanish that sort of have that qua beginning? Can you think of anything? I've prepped you a little bit for this. So what does it remind you of?
Four.
Four, that's exactly right. It reminds you of four. It should remind you of four. So the word quarantine, and I think I'm going to spell it right in English, quarantine, like that, yeah? So the word quarantine in English, really interesting, comes from not a Spanish word, but an Italian word. And it comes from the Italian word, and it's going to look funny on the screen, but it looks like this. Quarantena. This is it's actually not an Italian word, it's a Venetian word from the 14th and 15th century. And
what's the difference?
Say it again.
What's the difference
between
Venetian and Italian? Isn't Venice in Italy?
Yes, Venice is in Italy. That's exactly right. So nowadays, the Italian spoken in Venice would be indistinguishable from the Italian spoken in Rome or Florence. But in the 14th to 15th century, when this word came into existence, Italy was not a unified nation state. It was a sort of a series of cities that were self-governing and autonomous. And so they had slightly different dialects of Italian. Yeah. So the word quarantine comes from this word quarantena. And I think we could probably see that there's maybe something to do with like 40 or 4 in there, like cuatro in Spanish. So the word quarantena in Italian, in Venetian, in the 15th and 14th century, just means 40 days. Means 40 days. Any idea for everyone? Any idea what was going on in Venice in the 14th and 15th century? Well, lots of things, but
plague.
A plague. That's exactly right. A plague. The Black Death is going on. The so-called Black Death is going on in Italy in the 14th and 15th century. And the Venetian government instituted a policy according to which all ships that came into Venice had to sort of isolate themselves, wait off the coast for 40 days. That's exactly right. 40 days to make sure that they were free of the plague before they were allowed to dock at the port of Venice and unload their wares and their sailors and so on.
Seems like a long time to just sit on a boat.
No, it sounds awful. It sounds awful. And you have to keep in mind that people who were on these boats had been on them for months, possibly at the time. So you get to the port and then you have 40 extra days to wait. So it sounds miserable. And one of the things they didn't have, of course, was Netflix. So I imagine just practically insufferable. But anyway, this policy instituted by the Venetian government of requiring boats to wait off the coast of Italy, off the coast of Venice for 40 days came to be called the quarantena. The sort of the 40-day wait. And the term quarantena sort of works itself into normal vocabulary and comes to mean any attempt to isolate or seclude people who are potentially infected with the disease to protect the broader population. So if you know anything about Spanish, you may also know that The word cuarentena is closely related to another Spanish word, which is the word Quaresma. And you can see here that in Italian, the Latin Q is preserved, whereas in Spanish it tends to become a CU. But anyway, Quaresma. Quaresma. Any idea what the word Quaresma is?
Something like quarantine?
Something like, yeah. So it's related in some ways to quarantine, or it's at least related to 40. So the word Quaresma in Spanish means Lent. And Lent is, of course, the period in the Catholic Church and in other churches as well, the 40 days leading up to Easter. From Ash Wednesday to Easter, it's a 40-day period of fasting and prayer and purgation and things like that. So obviously, Quaresma is not related to quarantine. That is to say, Lent did not begin as a result of the plague, but they are linguistically related because of what that has to do with 40-day periods. Pretty cool, huh?
Mm-hmm.
I thought so. Okay, so that's quarantine. There's another word that we've been hearing a lot, also self-isolation. Yes, I think we're engaged in some self-isolation right now. So self-isolation, isolation is really...
So much isolation.
There's a lot of isolation. So the word isolation is really interesting, but I'm going to suggest, and you tell me if you think I'm right about this, I'm going to suggest that it's actually a misnomer. It's not actually the word we should be using. So the word isolation obviously means to be alone, but it comes from the...
I'm thinking Greek.
No!
Oh.
Close.
Latin.
Yeah, it comes from the Latin word insula. Maybe you can see it a little bit better if you think of the Spanish word for insula. And insula in Spanish is isla. So
that one I see.
There you go. Isla means island, of course, in Spanish. Just like insula means island in Latin. I was going to say Italian, but it's not Italian. So isolation really means something like islanding. So self-isolation.
I wouldn't mind being on an island right now.
Does sound pretty good, doesn't it? So self-isolation means islanding yourself, turning yourself into an island that is disconnected from the mainland. That's another.
Paul Simon did a song about that.
Did he really? What was the song?
I just know the chorus said, "I am a rock, I am an island."
Huh. Interesting. I'm familiar with Paul Simon, but I'm not familiar with that song. I have to check it out.
I'll spare everyone me trying to sing it.
Yeah. I mean, you do what you like. We have nothing but time. Anyway, so self-isolation, turning yourself into an island. Yeah. But of course, most of us are not actually engaged in self-isolation, are we? Most of us are around at least a couple of other people. I'm around Rachel, for instance, and she is, for better or worse, around me. So we're not really engaged in we're not really islanding ourselves. We're doing something slightly different. And this is why I want to argue that self-isolation is not the term we ought to be using. So here's another term that we need to know. So the word is this, the word peninsula. A peninsula. Do you know what a peninsula is, Rachel?
It's a sticky out bit of land. It's an island that's attached.
Ah, good. It's an island that's attached. That's exactly right. Yes. It's an island that's attached. And you can see here that the word insula, I'm not very good at this. You can see here that the word insula is actually in the word peninsula. It's like peninsula. And the prefix here is actually an adverb in Latin. So pen comes from this adverb in Latin, pine. And pine means almost an island. Or casi in Spanish. So a peninsula is a peninsula. It's almost an island. So I suggest that rather than describing ourselves as engaged in self-isolation, we describe ourselves as engaged in self-peninsulation.
That's a lot harder to say, though.
It is a lot harder to say. However, it has the great virtue of being
accurate.
That's exactly right. So obviously peninsulation is, as far as I'm aware, not a word. Microsoft Word also appears to agree with me, although that's never necessarily definitive proof. So anyway, self-peninsulation is what we're engaged in. We're not islanding ourselves. We are almost islanding ourselves. We're still connected to other people. We're just not connected to the mainland with quite the same vigor. Sure, quite the same frequency as we are ordinarily. So there we go. There it is. COVID-19 language tidbit update for March the 20th, 2020. Any concluding thoughts?
Tiny correction. It wasn't just Paul Simon. It was actually Simon and Garfunkel that did I Am a Rock.
I see.
Yeah.
Very good.
Just so I don't say a false thing in front of your students.
Sure. Mr. Garfunkel will be relieved to know that you've included him in the list.
I'm certain.
Very well. All right. I hope you enjoyed our language tidbit for today. And we will possibly see you later if any other interesting language tidbits occur to us. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Now we have to find out how to stop sharing the screen.
Is it the button that says stop share?
I think it is the button that says stop share. We know we're still recording, by the way.